The sound of a slap echoed through the marble-floored lobby of Monarch Financial Bank. "I've already called the police. We don't serve your kind here," Preston shouted, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings, making sure everyone in the bank could hear him asserting his authority. Customers froze mid-transaction, heads turning toward the commotion. Zora Timberlake stood perfectly still, her cheek reddening from the impact, her eyes never leaving the face of the man who had just struck her. Preston Reed, customer service manager, his name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Two security guards rushed over, not to restrain Preston, but to surround Zora. "You're under arrest, ma'am," they said. Phones came out as bystanders began recording what was unfolding before them. Another viral moment of discrimination in America. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, but most simply watched in silence, unwilling to involve themselves. Instead of responding with anger or fleeing in humiliation, Zora straightened her posture, adjusted the simple cardigan she wore over her plain blouse, and spoke in a voice that carried the quiet confidence of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she said, each word measured and calm, despite the red handprint forming on her dark skin. Before we delve into the story, if you stand against prejudice in financial institutions, click on the like and subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. You will definitely get a great reply to your comment. At 45, Zora Timberlake was the definition of self-made success. The daughter of a hospital janitor and a public school teacher, she had worked her way through college with 3 jobs, earned her MBA while raising her son alone after her husband's death, and built Timberlake Financial from a one-room consulting firm into a banking empire with assets exceeding $9 billion. Her face had graced the covers of Forbes and Black Enterprise. Her name appeared on donor walls at hospitals, universities, and community centers across the country. Her signature authorized transactions that changed lives and transformed communities. But none of that was visible as she stood in Monarch Financial that day. The designer suits and statement jewelry that defined her public persona had been replaced by off-the-rack clothes from a department store. Her normally immaculate braids were covered with a simple headscarf. The elegant glasses that had become part of her brand identity were exchanged for contact lenses. She looked like any middle-class black woman trying to conduct business at a bank. Which was precisely the point. What Preston Reed didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, Zora had acquired Monarch Financial in a quiet deal that hadn't yet been announced to the public or even most of the bank's employees. Only the board and highest executives knew that ownership had changed hands. The announcement was scheduled for the following month, after Zora had completed her undercover assessment of the bank's practices. For this wasn't just any bank to Zora. This specific branch of Monarch Financial held painful significance in her family history. 30 years earlier, her grandmother, Eloise Jenkins, had walked through these same doors seeking a modest home loan. Despite perfect credit and income that more than qualified her for the amount, she was denied with vague excuses about certain neighborhoods having different requirements. That rejection had altered the trajectory of her grandmother's life, forcing her to remain in rental housing that drained resources she could have invested in building generational wealth. Some things don't show up in audits and financial statements, Zora had explained to her executive team when outlining her undercover plan. Discrimination doesn't appear on balance sheets. Bias doesn't show up in quarterly reports. The only way to truly understand what customers experience is to become one. Her team had objected, of course. It was unorthodox, it was risky. What if she was recognized? What if something went wrong? Wouldn't it be better to hire mystery shoppers or customer experience consultants? But Zora had been adamant. You can't fix what you don't understand from the ground up, she had insisted. with the same quiet determination that had built her business empire. I need to see it with my own eyes, feel it with my own heart. That's the only way to create meaningful change. Away from the conference rooms and executive offices, Zora's life was defined by her relationship with her son, Jamil. At 16, he represented everything she worked for. The future she was trying to build, not just for her family, but for all families who had been systematically denied opportunity. Their modernist home, with its wall of awards and recognitions, reflected her success, but also served as a constant reminder of why that success mattered. The night before her third visit to Monarch Financial, the visit that would end with a slap and a police call, Jamil had questioned her methods over dinner in their sleek kitchen overlooking the city lights. "I don't get it, Mom," he said, pushing his plate aside. "You literally own the bank now. Why not just fire everyone and start over? Why put yourself through this experiment?" Zora considered his question carefully, the way she considered all questions from her brilliant, impatient son. Because firing people without understanding the problem doesn't solve anything. Those same people get hired somewhere else and continue the same behaviors. The system doesn't change. So you're gonna let them disrespect you? After everything you've built? Jamil's voice carried the indignation of youth, the belief that power should be exercised immediately and decisively. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is be underestimated," Zora replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "Your great-grandmother taught me that." She couldn't fight the system that denied her a loan from the outside. But I can change it from the inside. What Jamil couldn't fully appreciate, what few people in Zora's position could, was the double consciousness she had navigated her entire life. The constant awareness of being both a powerful banking executive and a black woman in America. Monarch Financial represented more than just another acquisition in her growing portfolio. It symbolized a reckoning with a system that had denied opportunity to people like her grandmother. The bank itself had a complex history that mirrored the country's complicated relationship with race and money. Founded in 1952, Monarch Financial had expanded through the boom years by financing white people while systematically denying loans to qualified black applicants. This was what Zora aimed to document through her undercover visits. This was why she stood in a simple cardigan and slacks in the lobby of a bank she already owned, asking for services that were hers to command. Have you ever been in a situation where you were judged or treated poorly based on assumptions about who you are? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might resonate with more people than you realize. Zora Timberlake's first visit to Monarch Financial began on a Tuesday morning, deliberately timed to avoid the busiest hours while ensuring enough customer traffic to observe typical service patterns. The branch occupied a stately brick building in the financial district, its marble columns and brass fixtures projecting an image of stability and tradition that had served the institution well for decades. The message was clear. This was a place of established wealth, where money was treated with reverence and respect. The question Zora sought to answer was whether all potential customers received that same respect. She had prepared meticulously for her undercover role. Her outfit, navy slacks, sensible shoes, and a cardigan over a plain white blouse, was chosen to present as a working professional of modest means. No designer labels, no luxury accessories, nothing that might signal wealth or status. She carried a well-worn leather purse containing a carefully crafted identity, a driver's license, credit cards, and bank statements for Zora Jenkins, using her grandmother's maiden name. The documentation showed a solid middle-class income as a self-employed consultant, excellent credit, and enough savings to qualify for any basic banking services. Entering Monarch Financial at 10:17 a.m., Zora joined the main queue where 4 customers waited for the next available teller. The lobby featured rich mahogany counters with brass fixtures. Potted plants and tasteful artwork created an atmosphere of understated luxury, banking for those who had already arrived, rather than those still striving. Zora stood patiently in line, observing the interactions ahead of her. A white businessman in his 50s was escorted immediately to a desk for private consultation. An elderly white couple was guided through retirement account options with solicitous attention. When it was finally Zora's turn, she approached the available teller with a polite smile. Aiden was 24, fresh-faced and relatively new to Monarch Financial. His crisp white shirt and precisely knotted tie projected an eagerness to follow protocol exactly as trained. When he saw Zora approach his window, a momentary flicker of uncertainty crossed his features with hostility. Zora stated her purpose clearly and professionally. She was new to the area, looking to establish a primary checking and savings account with the possibility of investment services in the future. She presented her identification and asked about account options that would best suit her needs. Aiden's response was the first subtle indication of the differential treatment Zora would document throughout her investigation. Rather than offering to connect her with a personal banker, as she had just witnessed happening for white customers with similar or lesser financial profiles, he provided her with a basic brochure of account types. "You can find all our account information online," he explained, his voice lowered slightly. "Or if you prefer, the ATM can help you open a basic account without waiting." It was discrimination wrapped in the language of convenience, the suggestion that using automated services rather than speaking with a human banker would somehow benefit her, rather than the bank. Zora noted Aiden's discomfort, the way his eyes darted briefly toward the customer service desk, where Preston Reed sat watching the interaction with narrow-eyed attention. "I'd prefer to speak with someone about my options," Zora replied pleasantly but firmly. "I have specific questions about your investment services as well." Aiden's discomfort visibly increased. "I'll see if anyone is available," he said, picking up his phone while avoiding eye contact. The brief conversation that followed was illuminating for its coded language. "I have a walk-in looking for account services." "Yes, she's requesting a banker." "I understand, but she specifically asked for a banker." "Okay, I'll let her know." He hung up and offered an apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "All our personal bankers are currently with clients. It might be a significant wait. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to use our online services? They're really quite user-friendly." As this conversation unfolded, the front doors opened to admit a white woman in her 30s, dressed in casual business attire not dissimilar from Zora's. Without hesitation, Preston Reed rose from his desk and approached her with an expansive welcome. "Good morning. Welcome to Monarch Financial. Are you looking to open an account with us today?" His voice, loud enough to carry across the lobby, was warm and solicitous. "I'd be happy to help you personally. We take pride in providing the human touch here at Monarch." The contrast was stark and telling, a textbook example of banking discrimination happening in real time. 2 women with similar appearance and stated needs, one directed to automated services, the other immediately offered personal assistance. The only difference was the color of their skin. Zora observed this interaction without comment, mentally documenting every detail for later comparison. "I understand there might be a wait," she told Aiden with the same pleasant tone. "I'm happy to schedule an appointment if that would be easier." Before Aiden could respond, Preston Reed approached, having settled the white customer with another banker. His assessment of Zora was immediate and dismissive, a swift visual calculation of her worth to the institution based entirely on superficial factors. Preston Reed embodied a particular type of institutional discrimination. At 38, he had spent 16 years at Monarch Financial, rising from teller to customer service manager through a combination of sales performance and careful political navigation. His tailored suit, expensive watch, and meticulously maintained appearance projected an image of success and authority he wielded with practiced precision. "I understand you're interested in our services," he began, his voice professionally cordial while his eyes communicated something entirely different. "For new clients, we typically recommend starting with our online portal to expedite the process. Our staff is quite busy with existing account holders." The implication was clear. Zora did not fit his profile of a valuable customer deserving of immediate human attention. It was discrimination dressed as efficiency, bias masked as standard procedure. "I prefer in-person banking," Zora replied, maintaining her pleasant demeanor while standing her ground. "I'd be happy to wait for someone to become available, or I can make an appointment to return." Preston's smile tightened. Without an existing relationship with Monarch Financial, new accounts have certain requirements. "Perhaps I could see some additional identification and proof of address?" "We have strict compliance protocols." It was another classic technique, requiring excessive documentation from some customers while waiving such requirements for others. Zora produced her driver's license, social security card, and a recent utility bill. More than sufficient identification for any legitimate banking need. Preston examined them with exaggerated thoroughness, holding her driver's license up to the light as if suspecting forgery. "I see you're self-employed," he noted, his tone suggesting this was somehow suspicious rather than completely normal. "We'll need to see tax returns and business registration documents before proceeding with any account openings." These were requirements not mentioned to the white customer who had entered after Zora, requirements not listed in any of the bank's public materials about account opening procedures. They were barriers selectively deployed to discourage certain customers like Zora. "I wasn't aware those would be necessary for a simple checking account," Zora responded, her tone questioning but not confrontational. "Is that a new policy?" Preston's expression hardened slightly at the challenge. "It's our policy for accounts we deem potentially high risk. If you'd prefer a more basic banking experience, there's a community credit union about 6 blocks east that might better suit your needs." The suggestion that she take her business elsewhere, specifically to a community institution rather than this prestigious bank, represented yet another discriminatory tactic, steering minority customers toward different financial institutions. Behind Preston, Aidan busied himself with paperwork, his reluctance to intervene equally clear. Zora thanked them both for their time and left the bank without arguing further, having witnessed exactly what she came to observe. The second day, she decided to visit again. The second visit, deliberately scheduled for the following day, would escalate these tensions as Zora returned more prepared and more persistent in her efforts to access basic banking services. Wednesday morning, Zora once again entered Monarch Financial, this time armed with additional documentation and a more specific request. She had analyzed the bank's published account requirements and brought every possible piece of identification and financial verification, far exceeding what should be necessary for opening a standard account. Her approach was calculated to eliminate any legitimate reason for denial. The lobby was busier than the previous day, with several customers waiting in the main queue and others seated in the consultation areas. Zora noted Aidan Fox at his teller window, his expression flickering with recognition when he spotted her. Preston Reed was engaged with another client, a white man in a golf shirt and khakis who was laughing at something Preston had said. Rather than joining the teller line, Zora approached the information desk where a receptionist directed customers to appropriate services. I'd like to open a checking and savings account and discuss your wealth management options, she stated clearly. I have an appointment. It was a small deception, but a strategic one. Claiming an appointment often triggered different protocols. Indeed, the receptionist immediately checked her computer, looking confused when she found no record of Zora's appointment. This momentary uncertainty created an opening that Zora smoothly exploited. That's strange. I spoke with someone yesterday who assured me I could come in this morning. I've brought all the documentation requested. She opened her portfolio, revealing meticulously organized paperwork. Perhaps there was a miscommunication. But since I'm here with everything required, is there someone available who could assist me? The receptionist, unwilling to contradict a potential client who presented with such calm confidence, picked up her phone to check for available bankers. During this exchange, Zora became aware of Bryson Walsh, the branch manager, observing from the doorway of his office. Bryson Walsh represented a particular type of institutional leader, one who maintained the appearance of professionalism and fairness while enabling discriminatory practices through selective attention and strategic absence. His management style consisted primarily of achieving targets by any means, while maintaining plausible deniability about how those results were obtained. Walsh approached with the practiced smile of someone who had spent decades in customer-facing roles. Good morning. I understand there may be some confusion about an appointment. Before Zora could respond, Preston Reed inserted himself into the conversation, having noticed her return. Mr. Walsh, this is the individual I mentioned from yesterday. She was advised about our documentation requirements for new accounts. The careful emphasis on individual rather than woman or customer spoke volumes about how Preston categorized Zora in the bank's hierarchy of client value. Walsh's expression shifted subtly. The automatic realignment of someone receiving a coded message they understood perfectly. I see, Walsh said, his tone cooling several degrees. Well, as Mr. Reed likely explained, we have certain protocols for new account holders without established banking relationships. Perhaps we should review what documentation you've brought? Zora presented her comprehensive portfolio: driver's license, passport, social security card, birth certificate, 2 utility bills, 3 months of bank statements from her current institution, tax returns, credit report, and business registration documents. It was deliberately excessive. No reasonable person could claim she had insufficient identification or financial history. Walsh and Preston exchanged glances as they reviewed her materials, their expressions suggesting they were searching for any reason to continue denying service. Finding none, Walsh reluctantly gestured toward an empty desk in the consultation area. Vivienne can assist you with the initial paperwork, he said, signaling to the loan officer who had been watching the interaction with practiced indifference. Vivienne Mercer approached with professional detachment. At 61, she had spent 4 decades in banking, starting as a teller when women in finance were still expected to wear skirts and serve coffee. As they settled at the desk, Vivienne began the account opening process with mechanistic efficiency. Her questions were technically appropriate, but delivered with a coldness not evident when she dealt with other clients. When Zora inquired about wealth management services, Vivienne's response was dismissive. Those services typically require minimum investments of $250,000. We generally recommend our basic savings options for customers beginning their financial journey. The assumption that Zora had limited resources, despite her excellent financial documentation, represented another form of banking discrimination, presuming lower financial capability based on race rather than actual qualifications. It was especially telling given that Vivienne had not asked about Zora's investment capacity before making this determination. I understand the minimum, Zora replied calmly. My investment portfolio currently exceeds $500,000, primarily in tech stocks and municipal bonds. I'm interested in diversification strategies. Vivienne's expression registered brief surprise before she masked it with professional neutrality. We would need to verify those assets, of course. The documentation requirements are quite extensive. Of course, Zora agreed. Though I notice the couple at the next desk seems to be discussing investment options without having provided such verification yet. Is there a different procedure for them? The couple in question, both white, both dressed in casual luxury that signaled comfortable retirement, were indeed engaged in an investment consultation that had begun with friendly conversation rather than demands for documentation. Vivienne's momentary discomfort at being directly challenged was quickly replaced by practiced deflection. Each client's situation is unique, she replied with bureaucratic vagueness. Now, for your checking account, we'll need to establish certain parameters. The conversation continued with Vivienne requesting more forms of identification than were required by policy, suggesting unnecessary account restrictions and repeatedly emphasizing minimum balance requirements. Throughout this process, Preston Reed circled their desk with the pretense of assisting other staff, clearly monitoring the interaction with growing irritation. When Zora politely questioned why she needed to provide additional employment verification when her tax returns already confirmed her income, Preston inserted himself into the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, directing the question to Vivienne rather than Zora, though his eyes fixed challengingly on the latter. "Ms. Jenkins has questions about our verification requirements," Vivienne replied, subtly distancing herself from the situation. Preston's response was immediate and practiced. "Our requirements ensure we provide appropriate services to only qualified clients. If our standard procedures surpass your expectations, perhaps another institution would be more suitable." It was the second time Zora had been encouraged to take her business elsewhere. A clear pattern of discouragement rather than customer service. Around them, other customers had begun to notice the tension, some watching openly while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones or banking materials. "I'm simply trying to understand which requirements are standard and which are selectively applied," Zora replied, her voice deliberately pitched to carry to nearby customers without seeming confrontational. Preston's face flushed slightly at the implicit challenge. Before he could respond, a white customer approached him with a quick question about deposit limits. Preston immediately shifted to warm, helpful engagement mode, his entire demeanor transforming as he turned away from Zora to address the other customer with a broad smile. This momentary interaction provided yet another documented example of differential treatment. The same banker presenting entirely different personas based solely on the customer's race. Several bystanders noticed the contrast. When Preston returned his attention to Zora, his expression had hardened into barely disguised hostility. "We'll need time to process your application and verify all documentation. We'll contact you within 7 to 10 business days regarding your account status." It was yet another delay tactic. White customers were opening their accounts on the spot. Zora faced an extended waiting period despite providing more comprehensive documentation than anyone else in the bank. Her calm persistence had clearly agitated Preston. As Zora gathered her documentation, she made one final observation designed to highlight the treatment. "I notice the white gentleman who arrived after me has already completed his account opening and received his temporary checks. Is there a reason my process would take 7 to 10 days while his was completed immediately?" Preston's jaw visibly tightened. "As I've explained, each client situation is unique. We've done everything we can to accommodate your request today. If you'll excuse me, I have other clients to assist." He walked away abruptly, leaving Vivienne to awkwardly conclude their interaction. As Zora left the bank, she noticed several customers watching her, with expressions ranging from embarrassment to anger. Outside, Zora made careful notes documenting everything she had observed during this second visit, the specific differences in treatment, the particular tactics used to discourage her, and the employees involved. The pattern was clear and consistent with decades of research on banking discrimination. What made her situation unique was that she wasn't merely documenting these practices as a researcher or journalist. She was experiencing them as the actual owner of the institution engaging in them. The third visit, scheduled for the following morning, would prove to be the breaking point, the culmination of tensions that had been building through her previous interactions with Monarch Financial's staff. Zora planned to request business loan information, a service that typically involved more extensive customer interaction and revealed even more about a bank's treatment of different demographic groups. Thursday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn, sunlight gleaming off the windows of Monarch Financial as Zora approached for her final undercover visit. She had dressed slightly more formally than previous days, still within the parameters of middle-class professionalism, but projecting greater confidence and purpose. Her documentation was organized in a leather portfolio, her manner composed and determined as she entered the now familiar lobby. The atmosphere shifted subtly as regular employees recognized her from previous visits. Aidan Fox glanced up from his teller window, then quickly looked down again. Vivienne Mercer deliberately turned away, suddenly fascinated by paperwork on her desk. Preston Reed, conversing with a colleague near the loan department, stiffened visibly when he noticed her entrance. Zora approached the information desk with direct purpose. "Good morning. I'd like to speak with someone about business loan options. I'm considering expanding my consulting practice." The receptionist, new to Zora, but clearly aware of her through staff communications, responded with practiced neutrality. "Do you have an existing business account with us?" "Not yet," Zora replied. "I'm in the process of evaluating banking relationships for both personal and business needs." The receptionist glanced toward Preston, who gave a barely perceptible nod. "Please have a seat in the waiting area. Someone will be with you shortly." The waiting area afforded Zora an excellent point to observe the bank's operations. She noticed Preston and Bryson Walsh engaged in hushed conversation, their eyes occasionally darting in her direction. More telling was Preston's subsequent conversation with several employees, clearly discussing Zora while attempting to appear as if they were addressing routine matters. After 23 minutes, during which 3 white customers were assisted immediately with various services, Vivienne Mercer approached Zora with a thin folder of loan information. "We have some standard materials about our business services," she said, handing over the folder without sitting down, a clear signal that this was intended to be a brief interaction rather than a consultation. The basic requirements are outlined on the first page. Zora opened the folder to find generic marketing materials rather than specific loan products or terms. "I was hoping to discuss options tailored to my particular business situation. I have projections and business plans I'd like someone to review." Vivienne's discomfort was evident as she glanced toward Preston, who was watching their interaction closely. "Our business lending specialists are all with clients at the moment. Perhaps you could leave your materials for review, and someone will contact you." Before Zora could respond, the front doors opened to admit a white man in business casual attire. Preston immediately approached him with an enthusiastic welcome. "Mr. Davidson, great to see you again. Hear about that business expansion loan we discussed? Bryson is ready for you in his office right now." The contrast could not have been more stark. Immediate, personalized service for one potential business client. generic materials and indefinite delays for another. The only difference was race. I notice your business lending specialists do seem available for some clients, Zora observed, her voice calm but carrying enough to be heard by nearby customers. I'm happy to wait if Mr. Walsh will be available after his current meeting. Vivienne's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the discomfort of someone caught enforcing policies she recognized as problematic. I'll check on that for you, she said, retreating toward the manager's office. During this exchange, Zora overheard fragments of conversation from behind the customer service desk, where Preston had rejoined several colleagues. Their voices were lowered. Third day in a row. Getting tired of this. Know their place. People like that always wanting special treatment. Zora had heard enough. She stood and walked directly to the customer service desk, where Preston and two other employees were still engaged in their whispered conversation. Their expressions as she approached ranged from surprise to alarm, the instinctive reaction of people caught saying something they shouldn't. "Excuse me," Zora said, her voice measured but firm. "I couldn't help overhearing your comments. I'd like to understand which policies at Monarch Financial support treating customers differently based on race." The lobby fell silent. Other customers turned to watch. Preston's face flushed dark red, not with embarrassment but with anger at being directly confronted. "I don't know what you think you heard," he replied, his tone defensive and dismissive. "But you're mistaken. Now, if you're not here for legitimate banking business..." "I've been here 3 days in a row, attempting to conduct legitimate banking business," Zora interrupted, maintaining perfect composure. "Each time, I've been treated differently from other customers. I've been asked for excessive documentation, directed to automated services rather than personal assistance, made to wait while others were helped immediately, and now I've heard staff using racial slurs while discussing me. I'd like to speak with the branch manager about these practices." Preston's expression shifted from defensive to threatening. "You're creating a disturbance in a financial institution. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately." "I'm simply requesting appropriate service and addressing concerning behavior," Zora replied, standing her ground. "There's no disturbance beyond the one created by discriminatory treatment." Around them, other customers had stopped their transactions to watch the confrontation unfold. Some had begun recording with their phones, sensing the significance of the moment. Preston stepped out from behind his desk, moving into Zora's personal space in a clear attempt at intimidation. "You need to leave. Now. Before I call security." "Please call security," Zora replied calmly. "I'd like them to witness this conversation as well. Perhaps they can explain why Monarch Financial has one standard of service for white customers and another for black customers." Preston couldn't contain his rage any longer. "You don't belong here," he shouted, then he lashed out physically. He raised his hand and gave Zora a slap that echoed through the marble-floored lobby. Gasps rose from watching customers. Phones raised higher to capture the assault. Behind his teller window, Aiden Fox reached for his phone with shaking hands, though whether to call security or police wasn't immediately clear. "I've already called the police," Preston announced loudly. "We don't serve your kind here." "They are coming to arrest and kick you out," Preston boasted. Through it all, Zora Timberlake stood perfectly still, one hand raised to her reddening cheek, her eyes never leaving Preston's face. The sound of police sirens pierced the tense silence that had fallen over Monarch Financial's lobby. Through the glass doors, red and blue lights flashed against marble columns as two patrol cars pulled up to the curb outside. Customers and staff alike watched with expressions ranging from concern to morbid fascination as 3 officers emerged from their vehicles, adjusting equipment belts and scanning the building's exterior with practiced wariness. Inside, Preston Reed straightened his tie with a sharp tug. The arrival of law enforcement seemed to confirm his authority, validating his perception of Zora as the true threat, despite being the one who had escalated to physical assault. "They're here," he announced unnecessarily to the room, his voice carrying a distinct note of satisfaction. "Security, please detain this woman until officers can take her into custody." Their entrance transformed the atmosphere instantly. The lead officer, a heavy-set white man in his 50s with the weathered complexion of someone who spent decades on patrol, entered with his hand resting near his weapon, eyes immediately focusing on Zora, rather than scanning the entire scene. Behind him followed a younger white officer with similar posture. The third officer, hanging slightly back from her colleagues, was an Asian American woman. Preston immediately stepped forward, positioning himself as the authority figure. Hand extended toward the lead officer. "Officer, thank you for responding so quickly. This woman has been causing a disturbance and became physically threatening when asked to leave. We've had to restrain her from attacking our staff." It was a breathtaking inversion of reality, a complete reversal of what had actually occurred and what dozens of witnesses had seen. Yet the confidence with which Preston delivered this fiction demonstrated his absolute belief in his own authority and credibility compared to Zora's. The lead officer nodded, accepting Preston's account without question, despite the visible evidence contradicting it, including the reddened mark still visible on Zora's cheek. His body language shifted even more toward perceiving Zora as the threat, his hand moving slightly closer to his weapon as he turned toward her. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands where I can see them and step away from other customers," he commanded, his tone making clear this was not a request. Throughout this escalation, Zora Timberlake maintained the same composed dignity that had characterized her response to being slapped. She raised her hands slightly to shoulder height, compliant but not submissive, and addressed the officers in a clear, measured voice that carried throughout the now silent lobby. "Officers, I believe there's been a misrepresentation of what occurred here. I was physically assaulted by this bank employee after questioning discriminatory practices. The entire incident is recorded on the bank's security cameras, and several customers have footage on their phones. I would respectfully request you review this evidence before proceeding further." "Sir," she addressed Preston while maintaining awareness of the entire situation. "You reported that this woman threatened staff physically. Can you describe exactly what happened?" Preston's confidence faltered slightly under direct questioning, and the dozens of witness eyes now focused on him. "She became aggressive when asked to leave, made threatening movements toward me, and refused to comply with lawful instructions to exit the premises." From the crowd of customers, a middle-aged white woman stepped forward slightly. "That's not what happened. He slapped her across the face. We all saw it. I have it on video." Other voices joined in, a chorus of witness accounts directly contradicting Preston's narrative. "Sir, multiple witnesses are contradicting your account. The bank security footage should clarify exactly what occurred. We'll need to review that immediately." Preston's composure cracked further under this direct challenge to his authority. "We can't just access security footage on demand. There are protocols, authorizations required from corporate security." "Actually," Bryson Walsh interjected, suddenly appearing from his office with the intuitive self-preservation of someone recognizing a shifting situation, "I can authorize immediate access for law enforcement. It would be our pleasure to cooperate fully with your investigation." Walsh's abrupt reversal, from supporting Preston to distancing himself from potential legal consequences, was the first indicator that the power dynamic within Monarch Financial was beginning to fracture. Preston stared at his manager with poorly concealed betrayal as Walsh led Officer Kimura toward his office, where security footage could be reviewed. The lead officer, now receiving contradictory information from multiple sources, maintained his position near Zora but with notably less certainty. "Ma'am, I still need you to move to a separate area while we sort this out." "I understand, officer," Zora replied with the same unruffled composure. "Before I do, I need to make one brief phone call. I believe it will help clarify this situation quickly." The request was unusual in a potential detention situation, and the officer's first instinct was clearly to deny it. But something in Zora's demeanor, the absolute confidence of someone unaccustomed to having reasonable requests refused, gave him pause. "Make it quick," she conceded grudgingly. "Keep your hands visible and the phone on speaker." Zora removed her phone from her purse and dialed a number from memory. The phone rang twice before being answered. "Miss Timberlake?" A crisp, professional female voice responded, audible to everyone in the silent lobby. The use of Timberlake rather than Jenkins created the first ripple of confusion among the bank staff who had been dealing with her under her assumed name. Preston's brow furrowed as he processed this discrepancy, the first seed of doubt taking root in his previously absolute certainty. Zora ended the call and returned the phone to her purse with the unhurried movements of someone who knew they had just fundamentally altered the situation. Around her, expressions of confusion spread among staff members. The mention of legal counsel had caused visible alarm on Preston's face, while the reference to the team on her call suggested an organization and authority completely at odds with the image of the isolated individual he had been so comfortable dismissing. "Who exactly are you?" he demanded, his previous confidence now undermined by uncertainty. Zora met his gaze directly, her response measured and precise. "That will become clear very shortly, Mr. Reed. I suggest you use these next few minutes to consider your recent actions and their potential consequences." The use of his name, which he had never provided to her during any of their interactions, created another moment of dissonance. Preston took an involuntary step backward, his certainty continuing to crumble as pieces of an unrecognized puzzle began taking shape around him. As this exchange unfolded, the glass doors of Monarch Financial swung open once again. The entire lobby turned to witness the arrival of what could only be described as an executive delegation. 3 impeccably dressed professionals entered with the synchronized purpose of a team accustomed to crisis management. In the lead walked Desiree, American woman in her early 30s, whose Armani suit and commanding presence drew immediate attention. Behind her followed a silver-haired white man carrying a leather briefcase with the unmistakable gravitas of senior legal counsel, and a younger South Asian man whose attention immediately focused on digital security, his tablet already displaying what appeared to be the bank's internal systems. Their entrance created an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The unmistakable arrival of authority. They moved with the confident ownership of space that comes not from arrogance, but from legitimate power, approaching Zora directly without hesitation or deference to the bank staff or even the police officers. "Miss Timberlake," Desiree addressed her with respectful professionalism despite the circumstances, "we've secured the necessary documentation as requested." She handed Zora a sleek leather portfolio embossed with the Timberlake Financial logo, a distinctive insignia recognizable to anyone in banking circles. The significance of this branding wasn't lost on Bryson Walsh, whose expression transformed from administrative concern to dawning horror as recognition set in. "Thank you, Desiree," Zora responded, accepting the portfolio and extracting several documents with embossed seals and official signatures. "Please provide the officers with copies of my identification and corporate documentation. Then ensure all security footage is preserved and backed up to our secure servers immediately." The casualness with which she named all the officers, none of whom had introduced themselves, created yet another cognitive disruption for those watching. This woman, who had been treated as an unwelcome intruder, somehow knew details that only someone with significant access or authority would possess. Turning to Preston, "Mr. Reed," she said, opening the leather portfolio to extract one final document. "I am Zora Timberlake, CEO of Timberlake Financial Group. 3 weeks ago, my company acquired controlling interest in Monarch Financial's parent corporation. The transaction hasn't been publicly announced yet, which is why you weren't aware of the change in ownership." She handed him the acquisition documents bearing corporate seals and signatures from both organizations' boards. "In simple terms, Mr. Reed, I own this bank, and have since before our first interaction." The document trembled in Preston's hands as the full implications crashed over him. The woman he had dismissed, demeaned, and ultimately assaulted wasn't just a customer, but his ultimate superior, the actual owner of the institution whose policies he had weaponized against her. His face drained of remaining color as he struggled to process this complete inversion of the power dynamic he had taken for granted. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, for how I treated you. I didn't know," he said. His voice was shaking, but Zora wasn't ready to listen. She had decided her judgment already. Bryson Walsh, demonstrating the political survival instincts that had advanced his career, approached the group with an entirely transformed demeanor. The obsequious smile of someone desperate to align himself with newly revealed power. "Miss Timberlake, had we known who you were, of course you would have received our premium service experience. There's clearly been a regrettable misunderstanding." "No, Mr. Walsh," Zora interrupted, her tone still measured but carrying new authority. "There's been no misunderstanding at all. What's happened over these past 3 days is precisely what I came to observe. How Monarch Financial treats customers perceived to have no power or authority. The treatment I experienced wasn't due to a misunderstanding. It was due to deliberate policies and practices that your branch implements daily against customers who look like me." Around them, the bank lobby erupted in hushed conversations and shocked expressions. Customers who had witnessed the discrimination now watching its dramatic exposure. Staff members reassessing every interaction they'd had with this woman they dismissed as unimportant. Security guards who had almost detained the owner of their institution at the direction of a manager who had assaulted her. Desiree stepped forward, taking the acquisition document from Preston's limp grip and returning it to Zora's portfolio. "Miss Timberlake, the executive team is assembled in the conference room as requested. Legal counsel has prepared the emergency action documentation for your signature, and HR representatives are standing by for immediate implementation of personnel changes." Preston looked wildly around for support, finding none as colleagues subtly distanced themselves from his rapidly imploding position. Even Bryson Walsh, who had enabled and protected Preston's behavior for years, now stood apart, already calculating how to position himself as ignorant of rather than complicit in the documented discrimination. Officer Kimura, who had been conferring with her colleagues, approached Zora with professional courtesy. "Miss Timberlake, do you wish to press formal charges regarding the assault? We have clear evidence and multiple witnesses." The question created another moment of suspended tension. Preston's professional future was already destroyed, but criminal charges would create permanent consequences extending far beyond this institution. Every person in the lobby seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what form justice would take in this extraordinary moment. Zora considered the question with the same thoughtful assessment she brought to all decisions. "No, I won't charge him, but he can't work here anymore. This isn't about one man's actions in isolation, but about transforming a culture that enabled and rewarded those actions." As Preston was escorted to the security office for processing of his immediate termination, the bank lobby remained in stunned silence. Customers and staff alike had just witnessed something extraordinary, Not just the exposure of individual discrimination, but the beginning of a reckoning for institutional practices typically hidden behind closed doors and bureaucratic language. Zora turned to address those watching, her voice carrying easily through the hushed space. Monarch Financial will be closed for the remainder of today, while we implement necessary changes. Customers, please know that these changes are designed to ensure everyone receives the respect and service they deserve, regardless of appearance, background, or perceived status. Staff members, a mandatory meeting will begin in 30 minutes to outline new expectations and accountability structures. With those words, she turned toward the executive offices, followed by her team and the officers who would document the formal complaints against Preston and potentially others identified through security footage review. As she walked away, her posture revealed neither triumph nor anger. Only the purposeful determination of someone who had confirmed exactly what she suspected and was now positioned to create meaningful change. The customers who had witnessed this extraordinary scene began filing out, many already sharing the story through texts and calls, some posting videos that would soon go viral across social media platforms. Before leaving, several approached Zora to share their own experiences of discrimination at this branch, stories that had previously had no pathway to accountability, but now found a receptive authority capable of addressing them. The afternoon sun slanted through Monarch Financial's towering windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor as the immediate consequences of Zora Timberlake's revelation unfolded with swift efficiency. Within an hour of her identity being revealed, the bank had transformed from a place of business to a stage where long overdue justice played out in full public view. What had begun as an undercover investigation had become something far more profound, a visible reckoning with institutional discrimination that would reverberate throughout the banking industry. Preston Reed's exit from Monarch Financial embodied the dramatic downfall his actions had precipitated. Security personnel, the same guards who had earlier almost detained Zora at his instruction, now flanked him as he carried a cardboard box containing hastily gathered personal effects. His tie hung loosely around his neck, his once immaculate appearance now disheveled by the stress of his complete professional collapse. His face, flushed with authority just hours earlier, now bore the sickly pallor of someone confronting irreversible consequences. As he was escorted toward the exit, employees and customers parted to create a path, their silent observation more damning than any verbal condemnation. The security cameras that had captured his assault of Zora now documented his ignominious departure. A symmetry of accountability that felt almost scripted in its perfection. At the glass doors, Preston paused for one final look at the domain he had ruled through intimidation and bias. Tears of regrets rolled down his cheeks. When the doors closed behind him, a spontaneous wave of applause erupted from customers who had witnessed the day's extraordinary events. It wasn't the celebration of one man's downfall, but the recognition of a system being held accountable, perhaps for the first time in their experience. Some approached Zora with handshakes and thanks, sharing brief accounts of their own experiences with similar treatment at this and other financial institutions. Each story confirmed the pattern she had documented, creating an oral history of discrimination that rarely appeared in formal complaints or regulatory reports. Preston's departure marked only the beginning of the afternoon's personnel changes. Vivienne Mercer, the veteran loan officer who had systematically applied different standards to different customers, followed shortly after. She was fired too. Her box of belongings, notably smaller, as if her decades in banking had produced few personal connections to the institution she had served. Her exit was quieter but no less final, her rigid adherence to discriminatory practices ultimately costing her the retirement transition she had planned after 40 years in the industry. Bryson Walsh, the branch manager whose leadership had enabled and protected these practices, made desperate attempts to position himself as an unwitting administrator rather than an active participant. His protestations of ignorance collapsed under the weight of evidence. Zora's team had methodically gathered security footage showing his presence during multiple discriminatory incidents, email records revealing his instructions to staff regarding client categorization, and testimony from employees who had received clear, if unwritten, directives about which customers deserved premium service. Zora fired him too. His departure created the most visible spectacle of the afternoon. Where Preston had maintained defiant silence and Vivienne had accepted her fate with resigned dignity, Walsh erupted in entitled outrage, demanding to speak with board members, threatening lawsuits, invoking relationships with executives who, he failed to realize, now reported to the very woman he had allowed to be discriminated against and ultimately assaulted in his branch. "You can't do this. Do you know who I am? Who I know." His voice echoed through the lobby as security escorted him toward the exit, his box of belongings clutched awkwardly against his expensive suit. 26 years. I've given this institution 26 years. What Walsh failed to comprehend, even in his moment of professional extinction, was that his length of service aggravated rather than mitigated his culpability. 26 years of enforcing discriminatory practices, of training new generations of bankers to perpetuate systemic bias, of presenting a respectable face to conceal institutional racism. These were not achievements to be celebrated, but a damning record of harm perpetuated under his leadership. As the glass doors closed behind the third terminated executive, Zora turned to address the remaining staff gathered in the lobby. Her voice carried the quiet authority that characterized her leadership style, neither triumphant nor punitive, but clear about expectations and consequences. What you've witnessed today isn't about individual punishment, but systemic change. Each person asked to leave was provided clear documentation of specific violations of policy, ethics, and in some cases, law. Similar reviews are underway at all branches. Those who choose to remain with Monarch Financial will operate under new standards of accountability, transparency, and respect for every customer, regardless of appearance, accent, zip code, or account balance. Her words resonated through the hushed space, creating a moment of reckoning for every employee listening. Some nodded in apparent relief, as if freed from participating in practices that had conflicted with their personal ethics. Others looked uncertain, perhaps calculating whether they could adapt to expectations that would fundamentally change how they had been trained to operate. A few glanced toward the doors through which their former leaders had departed, their expressions suggesting they might soon follow similar paths. Outside Monarch Financial, the day's extraordinary events were already spreading beyond the confines of the bank's walls. The first news van arrived within 30 minutes of Preston's departure, a local station responding to viral videos of the confrontation already circulating on social media. By the time the second and third terminated employees exited the building, a small cluster of reporters had gathered, their cameras capturing footage that would lead evening broadcasts across the city. How the media had been alerted remained officially unclear, though the strategic timing suggested Zora's team had ensured this reckoning would be public, rather than hidden behind closed doors and confidentiality agreements. Transparency was clearly a core value of her approach to institutional transformation, using visibility to create accountability that extended beyond one branch to the entire banking industry. By evening, temporary leadership had been established, preliminary findings documented for regulatory review, and a communication strategy developed for account holders concerned about continuity of service. What could have been chaos under less capable leadership instead became a case study in crisis management and institutional transformation. Decisive action guided by clear ethical principles and comprehensive evidence. As twilight fell and the last of Zora's team prepared to depart, she stood alone in the lobby where her extraordinary undercover journey had reached its culmination. The space looked physically unchanged. The same marble floors, wood-paneled walls, and imposing counters designed to project stability and tradition. Yet everything about what this space represented had been fundamentally altered in a single day. Looking toward the exit where her grandmother had been turned away 30 years earlier, denied the loan that might have changed her family's financial trajectory, Zora felt the weight of both history and future responsibility. The discrimination her grandmother faced hadn't disappeared. It had merely evolved into more sophisticated forms, hiding behind policies and practices that maintained inequality while providing plausible deniability to those who enforced them. Exposing these practices at one branch of one bank wouldn't eliminate systemic bias in financial services. But creating visibility, accountability, and consequences would send ripples throughout an industry that had long operated with impunity. More importantly, it would establish a model for transformation that other institutions could either embrace voluntarily or have imposed through regulatory action when similar practices inevitably came to light. With that understanding, Zora turned toward the exit, pausing only to straighten a painting that had been jostled during the day's events. A small act of ownership that symbolized the larger stewardship she had assumed over an institution in desperate need of reform. 6 months later, Zora Timberlake stood in that same lobby, watching as customers moved through a space transformed not just in personnel, but in fundamental purpose and operation. The physical changes were immediately apparent to anyone who had seen Monarch Financial before her acquisition. Gone were the imposing barriers that had separated bankers from customers, replaced by open consultation areas designed for collaboration rather than intimidation. Digital displays showcase the institution's community investment initiatives rather than investment products tailored exclusively to wealth management. Most striking was the diversity evident in both customers and staff, a natural result of removing barriers that had previously, by design rather than coincidence, created homogeneity in both groups. Monarch Financial's transformation had begun with immediate changes, but evolved through sustained commitment to structural reform. The day after the confrontation, Zora had announced a comprehensive third-party audit of all practices, policies, and procedures related to customer interaction, lending decisions, and account management. Rather than hiding the discriminatory practices discovered, she had made the findings public, acknowledging institutional failures while outlining specific reforms to address them. This transparency, revolutionary in an industry accustomed to addressing problems through confidential settlements and carefully worded press releases, created both challenges and opportunities. The initial media coverage had been intense and often critical, with analysts questioning whether exposing discriminatory practices would damage the institution beyond recovery. Competitors had attempted to capitalize on the controversy, positioning themselves as more stable alternatives while carefully avoiding examination of their own similar practices. Yet the public response had defied conventional banking wisdom. New account applications had increased by 34% in the first quarter after the changes, with particularly significant growth among minority customers previously underserved by traditional financial institutions. Corporate clients concerned with social responsibility had transferred substantial accounts to Monarch, citing the bank's demonstrated commitment to addressing systemic issues rather than merely publishing diversity statements. This philosophical reorientation had manifested in specific operational changes across all Monarch branches. The client categorization system that had previously sorted customers based on perceived value, with racial and socio-economic sorting barely disguised as financial criteria, had been replaced with service protocols, ensuring consistent experience regardless of account balance or appearance. Documentation requirements had been standardized and published transparently, eliminating the subjective application that had created barriers for certain customers. Most significantly, lending criteria had been completely redesigned based on actual risk factors, rather than proxies that perpetuated historical inequities. The use of zip codes as qualification factors, a modern iteration of redlining that had denied Zora's grandmother her loan, had been eliminated in favor of individual financial assessment. Community investment initiatives had been established in previously underserved neighborhoods, creating pathways to financial services for residents who had been systematically excluded for generations. These changes extended beyond policy to personnel. Under Zora's leadership, Monarch Financial had implemented hiring practices specifically designed to create a workforce reflecting the communities it served. Banking experience remained valued, but was no longer privileged above lived experience, community connection, and demonstrated ethical commitment. Every hiring committee included members from different departments, backgrounds, and perspectives to minimize the unconscious bias that had previously maintained homogeneity. Current employees had been offered comprehensive training on the history of financial discrimination in America, the psychological mechanisms of unconscious bias, and practical methods for ensuring equitable service. As she walked through the transformed space, Zora noted specific interactions that would have been improbable, if not impossible, 6 months earlier. An elderly black woman, in modest clothing, was receiving detailed investment advice from a personal banker who maintained the same respectful attention he had shown the wealthy white businessman assisted before her. A young Latino entrepreneur was discussing business loan options without the excessive documentation requirements that had previously created artificial barriers. A South Asian family was opening accounts with standard identification rather than the extraordinary verification once demanded of customers with similar backgrounds or accents. She smiled to herself, knowing finally the change she wanted was well reflected. If you love this story, click on the subscribe and share to others. See you in the next video.